The U.S. Bureau of Reclamation projects in 2 years' time, Lake Mead may be set to be at its shallowest levels in recorded history.
A massive construction project, and part of the infrastructure for that project still exists deep below Lake Mead.
3 miles under the floor of Lake Mead, in the dark, there is a tunnel. Las Vegas spent almost $1 billion to build it. But crews who dug it worked under the weight of trillions of gallons, with no backup plan if the rock gave way. And the reason they had to gamble that hard may be the most expensive mistake in the history of the West. The gamble underground. Here is the problem Las Vegas woke up to. Lake Mead had 2 pipes that brought water to the people. The first pipe went in back in 1971 when the lake was brimming, and the idea that it could ever fall that far felt like pure fantasy. A second pipe followed later, set only slightly lower, built as a backup in case the unthinkable ever happened. Both were designed for a world where Lake Mead stayed full, and that world was quietly ending. The water was falling toward the mouths of both pipes, and on the day it dropped below them, the taps in 2 million homes would cough and run dry. So the city made a choice that sounds less like engineering and more like desperation. If the water would not come up to the pipes, they would send a pipe down to the water, all the way down, not to the bottom of the lake but underneath it, boring through the rock below the lake bed to reach water at a height of 860 feet. That is lower than any city water intake ever built in the United States. To get there, they would have to drive a tunnel 3 miles long through hard rock and broken fault lines, while an entire lake sat directly overhead. Every single shift, the people doing the work stood under the weight of a whole lake, and there was no quick way out if something failed, and no second tunnel waiting as a backup. You drilled, you sealed the rock behind you, you trusted the math, and you prayed the ceiling held. Construction began in 2008, and the goal fit into one sentence that was very close to impossible. Reach the water no drought could ever take away, not down near the bottom of the lake, but to a point below even that, where no dry spell in recorded history had ever managed to reach. But almost from the first day, the rock had other plans. Into the rock. To do the digging, they built a machine the size of a nightmare. A tunnel boring machine roughly 2 stories wide and hundreds of feet long, so massive it could not be carried in on any road. So it was lowered down a shaft in pieces, 600 feet into the earth, and rebuilt in the dark at the bottom. Then it began chewing forward through the rock at a crawl, only about 35 feet on a good day, grinding toward a target 3 miles away that it had to strike almost dead center. Around 300 people worked the job in shifts, run by a special tunneling company owned by a big Italian engineering firm. And behind the machine, they lined the raw tunnel with thousands of heavy curved concrete slabs, sealing the rock as they went. And that was the first quiet terror of the job. 3 miles of drilling through shifting, fractured stone, and the machine had to stay straight enough to hit a small opening at the far end, so the crews corrected its aim over and over as it went. Let it drift even a couple of degrees, let the error pile up mile after mile, and it would miss the mark completely, and there was no backing up to try again. Then the rock began to fight back in earnest. The lake pressed down through cracks in the stone with a force that stunned even the engineers. Water pressure that climbed to the highest ever recorded for a tunnel of its kind anywhere on Earth, passed a record that had stood from a project in Sweden. Floods broke in and had to be sealed before they could widen. Sections caved and had to be shored. And the heat of steel grinding against ancient rock turned the tunnel into an oven, over 100 degrees in a space barely wider than the machine itself, where men worked knowing a full lake sat above them and any serious failure had almost no way out. It was slow, and it was dangerous, and it did not spare everyone. In 2012, a worker named Thomas Turner, 44 years old, was killed on the job when a high-pressure jet of sealing material struck him. He never came home. The tunnel that would one day keep 2 million people alive was already carrying a cost no budget line could measure. and the machine still had a long, grinding way to go, past cave-ins and floods and fault zones before it could reach the far end. But even then, nobody could have imagined what was coming because it was terrifying. The deepest intake in America. In December of 2014, after years underground, it finally punched through into the intake structure waiting at the far end, arriving almost perfectly on target after 3 miles in total darkness. The following year, the water began to flow, and the impossible thing was suddenly real. At the end of it sat the prize, an intake reaching water at a height of 860 feet, the deepest city water intake ever built in the country. A concrete and steel structure now sitting in permanent blackness under crushing pressure below the floor of a lake that 2 million people depend on to survive. Engineers compared the feat to the great tunnels under the rivers of New York and to the building of the Hoover Dam itself. 7 years, start to finish, and a price of about $817 million. To put that number in perspective, a single tunnel, a single pipe, a single intake had cost more than the entire yearly water budget of most American states. But here is where the story turns, because every cent of that came out of one pocket. The people and businesses of southern Nevada survived water bills that climbed higher year after year while the project ran over budget and behind schedule. Families watched their bills rise, not because they were using more water, but because they were paying for a tunnel being drilled beneath the lake that kept them alive. It was, in plain terms, a tax on survival, and nobody really got a vote in it. So the backlash came fast and loud. Critics called the spending obscene, all that money to chase a shrinking lake deeper into the ground when the same fortune could have gone toward recycling or conservation or pulling clean water from the sea. Environmental groups were sharper still. They said the whole project sent exactly the wrong message, that Las Vegas could keep growing forever because clever engineering would always rescue it at the last second. They were not entirely wrong about the message, but they were wrong about the alternative. And to see why, you have to understand what was actually draining the lake, because it was never really a drought. It was a piece of paper signed 100 years ago. The betrayal on paper. The real story of Lake Mead does not begin with climate change or with the neon sprawl of Las Vegas. It began in 1922 with a document called the Colorado River Compact, an agreement that carved up the river's water among 7 states. And the men who wrote it made one enormous mistake, though they had no way of knowing it at the time. They measured the river during a run of unusually wet years, some of the wettest in 1,000 years, and they assumed that flow was normal. It was not. So they promised out more water than the river has ever reliably carried, and not by a little, but by a lot. And a shortfall was written directly into the founding law of the American West. For a century, every farm and city and state along the river has been quietly drawing against water that was never really there. California built irrigation empires on it. Arizona built its suburbs on it. Mexico, at the bottom of the line, was promised a share it could rarely count on. The gap between the water on paper and the water in the river grew year after year, until it became visible from space, in the shape of a shrinking lake and that pale ring crawling up the canyon walls. Then science caught up with the truth. Tree rings and old sediment revealed that this river has a far darker history than the last 100 years suggested, with huge droughts that ran for decades at a stretch, dry spells so severe they would have drained Lake Mead completely and kept it empty for a generation. The 20-year dry spell that recently pulled the lake down to a quarter of its capacity may not have been a freak event at all. It may simply be the desert returning to its older, harsher normal, the one the entire modern system was never built to survive. So Las Vegas did not create this crisis. Las Vegas inherited it. And by the summer of 2022, as the water kept falling, the lake began handing back everything it had been hiding for the better part of a century. What the lake gave up. By the middle of 2022, Lake Mead had dropped to just 26% of what it can hold, the lowest level since the lake was first filled back in the 1930s. And only a year earlier, the federal government had declared the first official water shortage on the Colorado River in history. The change was violent to look at. Boat ramps ended in cracked, bleached mud hundreds of feet from the water. Sunken wrecks that had been swallowed decades earlier, including an old military landing craft, rose back into the sunlight, and that white ring on the canyon walls climbed higher and higher, a scar marking every foot the lake had lost. Then the ground itself started to speak. The ruins of an entire town rose back into daylight. St. Thomas, a settlement that had been drowned when the lake first filled and had sat underwater since 1938, reappeared as the shoreline pulled back, its old streets and building foundations exposed to the sun for the first time in more than 80 years. People walked down the main road of a town that had spent generations at the bottom of a lake. And then the lake gave up something far darker. As the water fell, human remains began surfacing along the exposed shoreline. In May of 2022, boaters found a rusted barrel stuck in the mud, and inside it was a body, a man who had been shot and sealed away by every sign back in the 1970s or 80s, during the years the mob still cast a long shadow over the city. More remains followed through the summer, and detectives found themselves reopening cold cases that had been frozen for decades, suddenly handing evidence the lake had been quietly holding for them. Investigators were careful to say there was no hard proof tying that barrel to organized crime, but the shape of it was hard to ignore. The lake had been keeping secrets for 50 years, and the drought was forcing them out, one at a time. Buildings the water swallowed during the Great Depression. A body the water swallowed during the casino era. All of it surfaced at once, simply because the water that had hidden it for lifetimes was no longer there. Photographs of the drowned town and the recovered remains traveled around the world, not as curiosities, but as a warning about what running out actually looks like. And yet drilling deeper was only ever half of this fight. The other half was learning to use far, far less, because no pipe, no matter how deep, could outrun the math if the city kept drinking at the same pace. The second front. While the engineers went down, the city as a whole turned and attacked the problem from the other side. And what Las Vegas pulled off here is the part most people flatly refuse to believe when they first hear it. Since 2002, the city has cut the amount of water each person uses by more than half, sliding from over 300 gallons a day per person toward roughly 140. And it did that, not in spite of growth, but during it, while hundreds of thousands of new residents and 40 million tourists a year poured through the valley. Even now, with all those extra people, Las Vegas uses less total water than it did 2 decades ago, which almost no other major American city can claim. The methods were deliberate and at times ruthless. Nearly every drop used indoors, in the sinks and showers and toilets, is cleaned and pumped straight back into Lake Mead, which earns the city a credit against what it is allowed to take out. As one water official put it, you could leave every faucet in every hotel running, and it would barely move the meter, because indoors, that water gets used again and again. Then they went after the grass. Nevada banned the purely decorative lawn that lines medians and office parks and front yards and serves no purpose but appearance, a change expected to save close to 1/10 of the region's entire water supply. They set limits on how much a single household can draw, and they made heavy use cost more with every extra gallon. The fight to pass all of that was, if anything, uglier than the fight underground. Homeowners resented being told there was a ceiling on something they had always treated as endless, and developers warned the caps would choke the city's growth. But the Water Authority pushed it through anyway, because the alternative was a city that grew until it could not drink. The desert does not care about anyone's property or opinion. It simply runs out when it runs out. And here is the gut punch. Las Vegas did nearly everything a city possibly can. and the lake still was not safe. Then, for one strange season, it looked like nature might hand the whole region a lucky break. The rescue that wasn't. The winter of 2022 into 2023 buried the Rocky Mountains under record-breaking snow, and snow on those peaks is exactly where the Colorado River is born. As spring warmed and all of it melted, the runoff came pouring down into the lakes. Lake Mead rose more than 20 feet in a single year. Lake Powell, upstream, climbed more than 50. For a moment, it felt like salvation had arrived out of the sky. But the scientists did not celebrate, and they were very clear about why. One extraordinary snow year, they said, does not undo 20 years of taking out more than the river puts back. Even after that huge rebound, the lake was still more than 150 feet below full. The recovery was real, and it was fragile in the very same breath, because it depended entirely on the kind of winter that the climate models say is going to grow rarer and rarer in the years ahead. And that snow is already gone. It drained back out of the system through evaporation, through irrigation, and through the simple downhill pull that runs the entire Southwest. The deep tunnel under the lake was built precisely for the years when that snow does not show up. And every serious forecast says those years are coming, and that when they arrive, they will hit harder than anything the modern record has ever measured. So the region is left staring at a hard truth. The most water-saving big city in America, sitting behind the deepest water intake ever drilled, still cannot promise itself another 20 dry years, which brings the whole story down to a single number. One number the engineers do not like to say out loud because it is the one thing no tunnel, however deep, can ever drill past. The number no one drills through. That number is 895 feet. It is called Dead Pool, and it marks the height at which water can no longer pass through the Hoover Dam at all, to anyone. Below 895 feet, nothing moves downstream. Not to Las Vegas, not to Phoenix, not to Los Angeles, not to the farms in California that grow a huge share of the country's winter food. The great faucet of the American West simply shuts off, and 40 million people across 7 states feel it at once. Here is the cruel twist in what Las Vegas built. Its deep new intake reaches water at 860 feet, which is actually below that dead pool line, so the city could, in theory, keep sipping from the lake even after the dam has stopped releasing a single drop to anyone downstream. That is how far ahead they drilled. They built a straw that outlasts the dam itself, but it does not outlast the lake, because if the water keeps falling past even that, the deepest intake in the country is left sucking at nothing in the dark, exactly like the 2 pipes above it. They drilled below where most pipes give up. They could not drill below the limit of the lake because no one can. And the record locked in those tree rings and ancient layers of mud says droughts capable of crossing that line have happened again and again over the past 1,000 years. The 1922 agreement that started all of this was signed in one of the wettest stretches of that entire millennium. Everything built since has been running on borrowed weather, and the loan is being called in. There is even a second, quieter threat rising underneath the first, because as the water drops and shifts, it stirs up old mud on the lakebed laced with heavy metals and old industrial waste, which means the tunnel secures the city's access to water without securing the quality of what flows through it. Federal planners have even floated the once unthinkable idea of bypassing another major dam upstream altogether, a measure of how fast the thinking has shifted as waterworks built for one era get torn up and rethought for a far harsher one. In 2026, all 7 states will finally sit down to work out all over again how they split a river that was never as full as those first signatures claimed. Arizona and California hold the oldest, strongest water rights and have long resisted the deepest cuts, while Nevada has done more per person than any of them. And whether that preparation gets rewarded or whether the shortage simply crushes everyone equally is the question that decade has to answer. No amount of drilling can make that decision for them. Right now, 3 miles under the lake, the intake still sits in the dark and the water is still moving through it. 2 million people will wake up tomorrow with working taps because of a tunnel drilled below the dead pool by people who knew there was no plan B. The lake holds for now. The ring on the canyon wall keeps climbing. So tell me, what do you think Las Vegas actually bought down there? Did they buy survival, or did they just buy a more expensive deadline? Because the water is still moving, and the clock is still running, and the number no engineer can ever drill through is waiting at the bottom of the lake.